Thanks for coming to Smithsonian Exhibit's open house. My name's John Powell. I'm an exhibit developer and writer here at Smithsonian Exhibits, and I'll introduce Bridget.
Hi, thank you. I'm Bridget Laurie. I'm also an exhibit developer and writer here at Smithsonian Exhibits.
And to give you a little more background on what we do here, we, as our name suggests, as our title suggests, we develop and write and edit exhibitions. So we help teams from across the Smithsonian and beyond plan, develop the content, write the content, edit, proofread, all that sort of stuff. So we are kind of the content wranglers, and we work with curators and subject matter experts to help them communicate with audiences for exhibitions.
So whereas they're definitely the experts in their topics, whether that's a historian, an art historian, engineers in some cases, and different things we've worked on, we come in with the expertise on how do you tell that story. So we do a lot of listening and a lot of conversation as a way of figuring out how can we communicate that to an audience, and what do you want to get across?
So today we're going to be talking about developing exhibitions that encourage critical thinking. And so why did we pick this topic? Well, we feel, and maybe you'll agree, that today we're kind of overloaded with information from all different angles. We have masses of information at our fingertips. Everyone does. Museums can be kind of a trusted source that can kind of help cut through some of that noise and help people make meaning, kind of filter some of that information, provide kind of trusted source of information, and
once upon a time, before the internet, for those of us who remember such a dire existence, but back then, one of the things that museums had as a trusted authority within just your communities and all of that was these were the people who knew the stuff. They could tell you the stuff. Well, now finding out that basic information is not as hard, right? So once upon a time when the internet was born, it turned into this way of sort of leveling the playing field. So instead of being that kid who didn't have access to an encyclopedia or couldn't walk to the library and lived out in the country, they were trying to do their best with what was available to them. Now that kind of got equalized. And now we've moved on to the point where now there's just a lot. And what does that mean? And how can museums help with that? How can museums take that authority that we luckily still seem to have, according to surveys, within communities as a trusted resource? And how can we help people sort of wade through that noise and figure things out?
So what are critical thinking skills? So there's a lot of different parts to critical thinking. These are just a few. I can read some of these out. Observing and identifying problems, evaluating evidence, noticing patterns and similarities, differences, comparing and contrasting different things, making connections, seeing things from multiple perspectives, different points of view, questioning your assumptions and also your biases. So these are some of the things that we think that museums can help do through exhibitions. So we wanted to share just some tips and techniques that we've learned over the years and have seen in other exhibitions that can kind of help strengthen these critical thinking skills. First of all, asking questions, a lot of different kinds of questions. Here we have an example on the screen of a what would you do question at the National Museum of the World War II Museum down in New Orleans. This is an interactive experience. It's a kind of a group-based activity where visitors stand in front of these touchpads, and they're presented with a real-life scenario from World War II, and they have to decide kind of what they would do if they were in the person's shoes, whoever's making the decision. And so it's a really I've done this, and it's a really interesting experience because, you can see sort of how other people voted, and it's a group activity, and you have to kind of quickly think what you would do as if you were in the hot seat, basically.
And one of the things one of the things that I personally like about being just that direct, sometimes people are like, well, is it fair to just throw that question out? What I like is that also then primes your audience, your visitors walking through for, oh, all right, I'm going to be asked questions, even if they're very broad like that. It sets up a tone of how am I going to engage with this material? And not every exhibit necessarily lends itself to that. I mean, there are certainly exhibits where you're going to walk through and it will be, here's the information presented to you, here's the case that we're making, here's what we want you to take away. But if you start off just as basic as, what do you think about this? What would you do? Hey, did you ever think about? When you prompt that question, it puts a different mindset in for a lot of visitors. So that sort of engages them in a different way as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can help build empathy and get your imagination kind of working. This is an example we worked on with the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and the American Anthropological Association. It's an exhibition called World on the Move that's all about the history of migration, human migration, and it's traveling to public libraries across the country right now. And so we had a lot of different questions in this exhibition. This example is as an interactive activity, kind of a hands-on thing where we asked visitors what they would bring with them if they were suddenly forced to move. And so it was, a suitcase, and you can choose sort of a limited number of things that you would bring if you were forced to move suddenly. The target audience for this exhibition was middle school and high school students. We have another example here of kind of more open-ended questions, kind of discussion questions that are broader, so less kind of you're not voting or picking your answer, but this is kind of just to get people thinking about how migration affects them personally by just asking more involved questions.
And this is from an interpretive master plan that I had the pleasure of working on with Ford's Theater. And after much discussion, we were trying to figure out, how can we get at, your big idea? How are you going to, they were looking at reinterpreting their entire exhibition experience. Obviously staying within the context of they're not just a museum, they're a historic site. So that's an interesting sort of line to walk when you're both the place where it happened and telling the story of what happened. So as we went through this and we tried to figure out, how are you going to do this? We realized by the end of weeks of talking that it was actually a question that was going to be their big idea. And everything went around the idea of why here, which is so simple sounding and really isn't. So it opens up, why was the assassination here? Why are we interpreting things here? Why are people visiting here? And down into, well, what is a memorial? And why are memorials built? And how did those decisions happen? So everything in there really came down to a question-based, how are we going to do this? So we left them, and unfortunately, the amazing timing that we brought to this is we gave them this interpretive master plan in late February 2020. So they've had some stalling on moving it forward for obvious reasons, and issues with some visitor testing when, they couldn't do that.
So another way that we can hopefully encourage some critical thinking is by letting visitors investigate and make their own discoveries. This was an online exhibition that we did with the Anacostia Community Museum recently called We Shall Not Be Moved, Stories of Struggle from Barry Farm, Hillsdale, which is a historic African-American neighborhood in DC, which has largely disappeared over the years through development and putting a highway through and all other things over the years. And rather than just telling visitors the facts, we wanted to kind of frame the whole experience as an investigation that visitors can kind of undergo. So we have, before and after photos, we have maps that visitors can explore, firsthand accounts from community residents, and it's all framed in that kind of investigate what happened to the neighborhood and kind of what made it disappear. And then visitors can kind of vote for what they think was kind of the key factor in that. So that's kind of how we organized that exhibition. as we said, you can also, find opportunities to compare and contrast different things. This is an example from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, learning activity they have, comparing different artworks. You can encourage visitors to notice patterns in information. Here we have an example from a museum in Decatur, Alabama, the Cook Museum of Natural Science, where they're focusing on patterns in nature and encouraging visitors to notice those.
Sure. And this exhibition sounds fascinating. Unfortunately, I was not assigned on this one, but so the idea of exploring the bias inside us, and there's a lot of questions that make you think about, well, why is it that I'm doing this, or why do I feel this way, or what's happening with the situation? So really, again, taking sort of a similar approach of asking for self-evaluation, but because it's a museum setting, it's not quite as harsh necessarily, because it's not like a sit down and think about what you did. It's like, why don't you think about how you got here? Are there other factors? And it's an interesting way of making people look at an uncomfortable situation or or a circumstance maybe they're not totally comfortable with, but by bringing it into this environmental walk-through sort of experience that makes it a little more sociable, a little more easy. You can take the time to analyze it on your own, not say in a workshop with your colleagues, and think through things on your own time.
I think that's a really good point. It's about designing kind of a safe space where people feel that they can, especially with the questions that we ask when we're asking people to share their personal opinions or stories. We try to create a safe space where people feel comfortable doing that. And part of it is in the design and also in the wording, having kind of a conversational tone, and that we're all in this together, we all have biases, we all have our own perspectives, and sort of acknowledging that, so that it's not, like Bridget was saying, it's not, telling you what you should think kind of thing. Exhibitions can also obviously give visitors problems to solve. This was a fun activity we did with the National Zoo in the Panda House, and sorry, the pandas are leaving. This is a maze that we created here at Smithsonian Exhibits that it's kind of a problem to solve, because it's basically the pandas have to navigate some of the pitfalls like deforestation and habitat loss, and get to the other side, get to the food and shelter and finding a mate. And so it was just framed as a kind of a puzzle type thing, and I think that's something that interactives are really good at doing.
Right. And one of the things that I like with interactives like this is it does work on those two different levels and makes someone come over and say, I want to spin the thing, right? If anyone's been there with a 9-year-old, they want to spin the thing. But it also, as you're going through it, you're like, oh, well, why am I solving this? And it just gives you another prompt for oh, this is what the pandas are dealing with, but at the same time, it's this fun, make the little puck with the panda picture go all the way down, and it's a construction site. No, we're trying to get to the bamboo. So it's a way to engage younger audiences, but also their older adults with them can get a little more out. And maybe that's your entree to have that conversation, if that's something you're trying to do with your kid.
The other thing that exhibitions can do is to expose visitors to multiple perspectives. Here's an example that we like from the Natural History Museum. This is in the Objects of Wonder exhibition, and it's just one object. I think it's a Thai offering bowl, but they have 3 different perspectives, and so there's labels on 3 sides of the case. And I think one is from a biologist, one's from an anthropologist, and the last one's from a conservator. So it's 3 different perspectives on the same object, and so that I think stuff like that is really effective in showing different points of view. And here's another example from the American Natural History Museum in New York, which is focused on a controversial statue of Teddy Roosevelt that they had in front of the museum for many years. It was recently removed, but it shows multiple perspectives on the statue from historians and activists and others, and it just shows you that it gets you to kind of maybe think differently and think outside of your own perspective and see, hear from other people, right? So that's all we had to share for today. We'd love to talk to you later about examples from your own museums. We know that we may have used some of your examples in our presentation, and we'd love to hear what other kinds of tips and techniques you guys have for encouraging critical thinking. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
How many associates do you have in your team to do this kind of work?
It's just the two of us.
This is the exhibit development team at SIE. Obviously there are other exhibit developers throughout the Smithsonian. So here at SIE, though, it's Batman and Robin over here. Oh, sorry.
How do you evaluate if it's been successful, that people have thought critically about what you've done?
It's a good question. Obviously, we encourage visitor surveys. I think that's a key way that you could evaluate that. We're an interesting case because we kind of come in for a project and then we disappear. So we don't, unfortunately, get to kind of, we follow up with the people we work with, but it's kind of out of our wheelhouse as far as visitor surveys.
Right. So I do like to find that out if possible. But like John said, just the nature of what we're doing here is someone else is picking up at that point. But if you're interested in just checking on your own, you could do visitor surveys. You could do formal evaluation. You can also, if you have a docent space, ask docents to just report back. It would be anecdotal. It wouldn't be a formal thing necessarily. Hey, are people talking? Are people working on this? Are fights breaking out, or do we go too far? You can find out anecdotally if things are working, and depending on how you do some of these things, there might be options to tweak things later. Sometimes signage can come in and out. Sometimes you could put in a new prompt. My project managers would yell at me for telling you that that's something we can do, but there are options for ways to tweak things.
Just to follow up on that, I would say with the migration exhibit example that I gave, we were able to prototype that with kids in public libraries, so we were able to actually do some testing beforehand. So
and we did the same with the Panda Maze. Oh, great. So the Panda Maze also had a couple rounds, including we had a delightful 5th grade class that came in and played around with it early on and helped us figure out some final graphics and this is confusing. This doesn't look like construction, and they were able to be as bluntly honest as 5th graders tend to be.
So in the exhibit you just showed, the objects of wonder, were those ammonites, were they 3D printed, or is it a mold? Or do you know?
For the
objects of wonder, natural
objects
history.
of wonder, I believe they're all actual objects.
Okay.
I love that exhibit. I did not. They did it entirely in house, as far as I know, so I was not involved. But I really love that idea of here is one object, and we're going to tell you what 3 different people think about it, because it's not that one was more important. They're all equally important with very different ways of looking at that content, and that. Even if you just walk away going, wow, I wouldn't have thought to look at it as a conservator, or I wouldn't have thought to have looked at it from an art perspective because I was coming from the anthropology perspective. It's an interesting way to just remind people that there are other ways to view things.
Yeah, that's an awesome exhibit. Now I just got to go back in there now and revisit that one. Thank you.
So I was just wondering how much consideration you put into how the different elements of the exhibit will work together. Is it more powerful if you have an interactive kind of question thing, if it's the only one and it's a focal point, or do you reiterate the same kind of questions in multiple kind of methods?
I think it depends a lot on the specific exhibit, and that's definitely one where we would work with our curator or whoever our our historian, whoever our subject matter expert was on that. We also are very lucky here that we work with the designers very closely. So I might just walk over and say, oh, Lena, would this work? And sometimes it comes down to, those are going to be too close together. It's not going to make sense to put this question here because the way the gallery is set up, you're going to have it here, and then they're going to walk 12 feet, and they're going to have the same question. But sometimes it might be like, you know what, if we mentioned it once per gallery space, maybe that would work. So there is a combination of, if you have the option to evaluate, great. But also making sure you're, is this helping you stay on message, or is it, is there maybe a different way to ask a very similar thing? Just what is the point that you're trying to get your visitors to get at? So one of the great and frustrating things about exhibits is we don't make the same thing twice, right? So once you get really great at making the one, you're not going to make it again. But so it's one of those ways that you learn from experience and you see what worked and you hope it applies.
I would say also, I think you could overdo it if your whole exhibit was full of nothing but these critical thinking techniques. It might be too much. So it's trying to find a balance. And I think we always start with the story and try to figure out what the messages are, and then find the right delivery method for those. Whether maybe this thing lends itself to a question or this thing lends itself to some sort of interactive, but we try not to start from that end. So there's a question over in the back.
Yeah, how do you think about creating an experience that is both accessible to a broad audience and satisfying for someone who might be coming in already with some content knowledge or with a specific interest?
Sure. Well, I think we can't know whether our visitors will have prior knowledge. So we're to be the most inclusive and accessible. We try to start assuming that visitors don't have much information about our topic, and that's easy for me and Bridget because we're not experts in these topics. So whatever the topic is, we come into the team and we ask these questions, and we don't, the curators are experts, and so I think but at the same time we don't want it to be oversimplistic. We try to make sure that there are levels of content where you can have an opportunity to dive deeper, and so that's partly in how we have a hierarchy of information, and we draw visitors in with headlines and short text blocks, and then if they want to learn more, there could be more information lower in the hierarchy or online, or they could. There's plenty, as we were saying, there's plenty of places to get the information. Our job is really more to get people curious and to get them interested in the information so that they want to find out more. So we don't feel that there are people who are subject matter experts and history buffs and stuff, but we feel like we try to include them as well, but we have to kind of spread a broader net to catch everyone.
And if you had an exhibit, a specific exhibit where you were going after a very specific, well-knowledged audience, you could develop something for that. Early in my career, I worked on a project that was at a medical, it was being shown as a history exhibit at a medical convention. Every single person there was a doctor. I got to use all the big words. Reading level was out the window. Let's talk PhDs. So that was really fun on that way. I had a steep learning curve because I had to get up to conversant with oncologists, which was a challenge. I like to think I at least was pleasant when speaking with them. But if you have a situation like that, you can go ahead and gear it further up. But if, in general, I would say that audience is maybe coming in to see the stuff. Sometimes they might be like, okay, I know all about this, but I've never seen the bowl. I want to go see the bowl. I want to go see this sculpture. So sometimes that is enough, but you really need to know who your audience is on something like that.
Speaking of audiences, I'm wondering, how did that Panda Maze hold up with all the 9-year-olds who like to spin it? And just have you had any issues with durability of stuff that you've worked on?
So as far as I know, it held up pretty well. I was actually at the zoo, and I didn't hear complaints when I was there with my own 9-year-old. But we do actually have the people who built it downstairs talking in fabrication and in graphics. So if you want real nitty gritty on how that was tested, they have that. I know that it did get quite a bit of testing, and people seem to be very happy with it. It did seem to hold up, but I am not the person to have that info.
No, they have a fun process where they actually try to break stuff. So it's they push it to the limits, and it's very durable. And that one in particular, because we did a prototype and we did a couple different versions, and so it's pretty robust. That I think, yeah. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much out of time, but thank you all for coming, and stick around. There's more talks, and thank you.